Welcome to Gloria Day, Old Swedes Church. We are filming our second pandemic version of Great Talks at Gloria Day. We are following the CDC guidelines. The agenda will be as follows. After I intro Jack will speak, then we will show a video clip of our historian Jeanette Ware, who will talk a little bit about the Hook and Hastings organ here at Gloria Day. And then I'm going to give you a very quick overview of what we're doing with our Keystone Grant projects. After the video plays, we will then have a live Q&A. So first, by way of introducing Jack McCarthy, our speaker for this program. Jack is an archivist and a historian in Philadelphia, and he's directed a number of major projects about public history and archive projects in Philadelphia. And he serves as the archivist for the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Mann Music Center. Jack has directed projects in music and business and industry and Northeast Philadelphia. He lectures around the area, and he participated in a Pew-funded project to organize the Philadelphia jazz history, and that was in 2019 and 2020. So, Jack, we're very excited to have you here today, and we're looking forward to what you have to say, and the music that you're going to play for us as well is very exciting. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Candy. Pleasure to be here. I'm particularly pleased to be giving this talk in this space, this very important historical space, because as we will see shortly, this place is the site of some of the earliest documented musical performances in Philadelphia history. So it's really appropriate to be giving this talk in this sacred and important space. The name of my talk, the title, is A New Art With Us. And that title comes from a letter that Benjamin Franklin wrote to a friend in Scotland in 1763. The man's name was Andrew Dick. And Dick's daughter had sent Franklin's daughter, Sally, some Scottish songs as a present. And Sally and her father wanted to return the favor by sending their Scottish friends some American songs. But they couldn't find any. As Franklin wrote to his Scottish friend, there had not yet evolved a distinct or characteristic American music. He said, music is a new art with us. And Franklin was referring to colonial America as a whole, but his description applies specifically to Philadelphia as well. As we will see, music in Philadelphia in the early years was very sparse, and it wasn't really a flourishing art. Then over the course of the colonial period, it became much more common, and Philadelphia became an important musical center. So I'm going to cover a period of exactly 100 years, from 1677, when we can say with reasonable assurance that music was practiced in a particular place by a particular group of people, and that place was actually here. And then 100 years later, in 1777, when the British occupied Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War. And now, the colonial period that I'm covering today technically ends in July of 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, just about a mile from here. But the war really came home to Philadelphia the following year, when the British occupied the city. All of the music making that had been happening in Philadelphia that we're going to talk about today in the 1770s just stopped, and the city was kind of, a ghost town as far as the local inhabitants were concerned. And music making, public music making, didn't really revive again until later in the 1780s. So that 1777 date is kind of a turning point, or the end of an era in the history of Philadelphia music. So we're going to cover this 100-year period and the evolution of music in Philadelphia over that time. Now, as many of us know, Philadelphia was founded in 1682 by William Penn and Quakers, members of the Religious Society of Friends. And the Quakers were very progressive in many ways, but when it came to the performing arts, they were the absolute worst. They did not practice music either in their religious services or in their personal lives. This quote here from George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, kind of sums up the Quaker attitude. I was moved to cry also against all sorts of music, for they burdened the pure life and stirred up people's minds to vanity. So the Quakers in this period at least, viewed music as a vain, self-indulgent activity that sort of detracted from the pure spiritual life. That was their attitude towards music. It changed in later years, but that was the attitude then. In 1716, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Friends, which is the ruling body, governing body for the area Quakers, issued this directive. Members are advised against going to or being in any way concerned in plays, games, lotteries, music, and dancing. So we can see this Quaker attitude toward music. And because of that, the Quakers were the dominant group in the very earliest years of Philadelphia history. They controlled the government and the public institutions and social life. So because of that, there wasn't much music in the mainstream of Philadelphia society. Music was practiced by the fringe groups. And Philadelphia, as a result, was well behind other colonial cities in public musical development. Cities like Boston, New York, Charleston had public music way earlier than Philadelphia did. However, the Quaker attitude really did suppress music to a large degree, but William Penn created Pennsylvania and Philadelphia as a holy experiment, a place where people of all faiths could practice their religions freely. And because of that, large groups of other religious denominations came to Philadelphia and settled here. And they did practice music. And over time, the Quaker influence in Philadelphia began to diminish. And by the middle of the 18th century, a public musical life begins to emerge as the Quaker influence diminishes. And then by the 1770s, Philadelphia is a flourishing musical center, and in fact, it's the cultural capital of the American colonies. So we're going to trace this development over this 100-year period where the musical landscape went from fairly barren to absolutely flourishing. And that's what we're going to cover. Now, we're going to look at 4 groups that were practicing music in the very earliest years of Philadelphia. By that, I mean the late 1600s and very early 1700s. And we're going to start with the original inhabitants, the Lenni Lenape, the Native Americans. They were here for thousands of years before the Europeans got here. By the time Philadelphia was founded in the late 17th century, they had been decimated by years of diseases introduced by the Europeans, as well as wars with other tribes. So by the time Philadelphia was founded, there were a few thousand Lenni Lenape scattered throughout the greater Delaware Valley, from the Delaware Bay down to Delaware to the lower part of New York. And by the mid-18th century, they were pretty much gone from this area. They had pretty much been forced out, and they took their musical traditions with them. Eventually, many years later, most of the tribe ended up in Oklahoma, where they are still there and still practicing their music. But as far as influencing music in Philadelphia, they really didn't, because they were pretty much forced out in the very early years. Their music was an oral tradition. It was not written down, but we have a number of descriptions, or actually a couple of descriptions of it that are remarkably similar, and they come from very prominent people. The first being William Penn, who wrote, "Their worship consists of 2 parts, sacrifice and cantico. Cantico is performed by round dances, sometimes words, sometimes songs, then shouts, 2 being in the middle that begin, and by singing and drumming on a board, direct the chorus. Their postures in the dance are very antic and differing, but all keep measure. This is done in equal earnestness and labor, but with appearance of great joy." And then the other description comes from another prominent Philadelphian, Daniel Pastorius, a German immigrant who arrived here in 1693. He's the founder of Germantown. He writes, "When they sing, they dance around in a circle, and in the midst, two dance and start a sad song. All join in a weird cry. Then they weep, snap with their teeth, soon crack their fingers, stamp with their feet, and continue this laughable play earnestly and zealously." Pastorius' description is a little condescending there at the end. William Penn's is not quite so condescending, but they're very similar descriptions of the musical religious practices of the Native Americans. But as I said, they were pretty much gone from the area by the early 1700s, and their musical tradition really did not affect the greater musical development of Philadelphia. The next group we're going to look at are the Swedes, who established this church. They began settling in the greater Delaware Valley in the 1630s. In 1638, they came and settled and established the colony of New Sweden, which was mostly centered down in the Wilmington area, but they had these outposts around the area, one of which was here in this area that was then called Wicketco, which is now South Philadelphia. And in 1677, they built a blockhouse, or a small fort, here on this site. And they also used this blockhouse as a chapel for religious services. And we know that Swedes were Lutherans, and we know that Lutheran hymns were a very important part of their services. So we can say with confidence that music was practiced here on this site beginning in 1677. Not in this building, which was built later, but in the blockhouse that stood on this site. So this is the first time in Philadelphia history we can say that music was practiced here, in this time frame, in this specific place by these people. And this is a replica of the blockhouse that was built by the Swedish Colonial Society in 1926 for the sesquicentennial. We're not sure how accurate this is, but there are descriptions of the blockhouse, and these seem to conform to that. But in that building, or something like that, on this site is where Swedish Lutheran hymns would have been sung. And one of the hymns that we know they sang was "All Glory Be to God on High," which was sung each Sunday here at Wicketco. It dates to the 1500s. And the Swedes sang in unison. They did not sing in harmony. So we're going to hear this hymn, "All Glory Be to God on High."
All glory be to God on high, who hath our race befriended. To us no harm shall now come nigh, the strife at last is ended. God showeth his goodwill to men, and he shall reign on earth again. Oh, thank him for his goodness.
So that's a hymn you would have heard on this site starting in the 1670s. Now, in 1697, Andreas Rudman arrives here from Sweden, and he's the new pastor here, and he's very musical. He brings with him a spinet, a small keyboard. He brings hymnals, and he kind of revives the music here on this site. The music had kind of suffered and declined because of lack of active pastors for a number of years. So when Rudman got here, he really revived the singing. And in 1700 and 1701, he published hymnals for the congregation of Swedish Lutheran hymns. And these are the first hymnals published in America. And you're going to hear me say a number of times throughout this talk, the first this, the first that, the first this in American history, because many, many important musical milestones in American musical history happened here in Philadelphia. So these hymnals that Rudman published were, again, the first in America. I do want to give a shout out to Kim Eric Williams, a noted historian of the early Swedes here in Pennsylvania, in the Delaware Valley, who was very helpful in providing me with a lot of information. A lot of the published information, the traditional sources are incorrect. And he's done a lot of original research and disproved some things and confirmed other things. So he's been very helpful. I do want to acknowledge his help. In 1698, Rudman organizes the building of this church, Gloria Dei, Old Swedes, from 1698 to 1700, and it was completed in 1700, and there was a dedication ceremony on July 2nd, 1700. That dedication service included music. Rudman describes it later in a letter, all the different hymns that were sung. So this is the first time we can say that on a specific date, in a specific place, music was practiced in Philadelphia. Again, the very first time we can say that. Rudman actually died at the age of 40, but he's buried here. Now, another figure that's kind of prominent in all this is Justice Faulkner, who is a German Lutheran immigrant who arrives in Philadelphia in 1700. He shares a Lutheran faith with the Swedes. He's a German, but the Germans don't yet have a church in Philadelphia, a Lutheran church. So he associates here with the Swedes who are practicing their Lutheran faith. Initially, he lives with the hermits of the Wissahickon, who we're going to talk about in a minute. But in 1703, he was ordained a Lutheran minister here in this church, November 24th, 1703. This is the first Lutheran ordination service in America. And we know there was music also at this service. The music may have been provided, or the musical accompaniment may have been provided by the mystics of the Wissahickon, the hermits of the Wissahickon. It's not documented, but it's very likely since they had a very close relationship. Now, Faulkner doesn't stay here that long. He actually ends up going to New York and ministering throughout the Hudson Valley. But he was here for a few years, and an important thing happened for musical history purposes is in 1701, he writes a letter back to a bishop in Germany. And it's kind of a report on the state of Lutheranism here. It's also, he's requesting an organ for this church. And as he says, if an organ instrument were placed in the Swedish church, for the Germans as yet have no church, and the Swedish church is of a high build and resonant structure, it would prove of great service to this church. In the same letter, he goes on to say, a well-sounding organ would perhaps prove of great profit, to say nothing of the fact that the Indians would come running from afar and near to listen to such unknown melody. Such an extraordinary love have they for any melodious and ringing sound. So we know from this report that the Lenape loved musical sound. And then another revealing statement he makes in this same letter is, I will here take occasion to mention that music would contribute much towards a good Christian service. Now, as the melancholy, saturnine, stingy Quaker spirit has abolished all such music, it would indeed be a novelty here. And if you're like me, you're wondering when you read this, what the heck does saturnine mean? It means gloomy, somber, humorless. So here is like proof positive of the effect that the Quaker attitude towards music had on the greater musical development of Philadelphia. These groups were practicing music, but not like the mainstream of Quaker society. The next group we're going to look at is a group that Faulkner associated with when he first came to Philadelphia, and that's the Hermits of the Wissahickon, or the Mystics of the Wissahickon. That's a band of 40-some German pietists who leave Germany and come here in 1694. They settle along the Wissahickon Creek near Germantown. They're a very unusual group. They're very sort of insular and mystical. They're studying astronomy and astrology and botany, but they're also practicing a very advanced form of music for that time in American history. They brought an organ with them. They probably brought other instruments. And so they're practicing this really unusual tradition of music for early America. Their leader, Johannes Kelpius, was a scholar and a mystic. This is a painting of him by one of the group named Christopher Witt. This is the first oil portrait in American history. This is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This is a painting of Johannes Kelpius, the leader of this group. They were a celibate group, so they really didn't last long. Kelpius died kind of young, and then the group sort of peters out and sort of disperses, and there's kind of no trace of them. There is a historic marker in Wissahickon there, park about them, and they lived in caves. They had a common sort of tabernacle building that is their common building, but individually they lived in caves. And there's this, what's probably a much later spring house there in that area, but people would call it Kelpius's Cave. It's most likely not, but people go to visit it and they call it Kelpius's Cave. There's really little trace of them today, but we have their musical manuscripts. These are probably the earliest musical manuscripts in American history, also at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This particular one, there's a couple of different ones. One's at a hymn text that's at the Free Library Special Collections, and this hymnal, which is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, has this very long title, but it's been shortened to Lamenting Voice of the Hidden Love. But if you're musical and you look at this, you can see that there's 3 and 4 part harmony. There's very complicated bass lines. So this music was really advanced for the time. And some later scholars have taken this music and arranged it for more recent performance. So this is sort of a reconstruction of what this music may have sounded like. We really don't know what it sounded like, but scholars have taken these musical manuscripts and made arrangements and performed them. So this is a performance of one of the hymns from this hymn. So next, we go to the other group that was practicing music in the very earliest years of Philadelphia, and that's the African Americans. Now, of all the groups, and we're looking at these earliest groups, the African Americans had the most profound and long-lasting influence on Philadelphia music history. Not so much in the colonial period when they were very restricted, most of them were slaves, but later, the music that they were making, forging their African musical traditions with the European music to which they were exposed, resulted in amazing new styles of music for which America is renowned. Jazz and gospel music and soul music and rhythm and blues. So all of that music came out of what we're going to talk about here. So the African Americans began arriving here in very small numbers in the mid-17th century. Then in 1684, a ship comes with 150 slaves, and this is the beginning of the major slave trade in early Philadelphia. By 1710, the slaves constituted about 20% of Philadelphia's population, and then later in the colonial period, Philadelphia had the largest population of free blacks of any city in colonial America, so there was a mix of free and enslaved. During the colonial period, their movements were very restricted. Their liberties were they didn't have liberties. But nonetheless, they preserved their African musical traditions in the city, as we will see. So one of the most important descriptions of this music practicing comes from John Fanning Watson, who writes, "Many can still remember when the slaves were allowed the last days of the fairs for their jubilee, which they employed in dancing the whole afternoon in the present Washington Square. In that field could be seen at once more than 1,000 of both sexes, divided into numerous little squads, dancing and singing, each in their own tongue, after the customs of their several nations in Africa." Now, John Fanning Watson is like Philadelphia's first historian. And he's working in the early 1800s, and he's interviewing people who were alive in the colonial period. He's reviewing documents and collecting information. And so he publishes this book first time in 1830. And it's basically a compilation of all these stories and information that he's compiled. He doesn't really cite any particular source, so that's unfortunate. But these are the reminiscences of these people that were alive in the colonial period. Now, because he was working in the 1820s and 1830s, he was most likely interviewing people who were alive in the later part of the colonial period, not the early part. But we have some documentation of earlier that seems to corroborate what Watson has written. And the first is this, the minutes from 1693 Provincial Council of Pennsylvania include this note that an order made by the Court of Quarter Sessions of the County of Philadelphia against the tumultuous gatherings of the Negroes of the town of Philadelphia on the first days of the week. And then in 1732, the minutes of the Philadelphia City Council say, taking under consideration the frequent and tumultuous meetings of the Negro slaves, especially on Sunday, it is by this board thought necessary that an ordinance be forthwith drawn and prepared to prevent the same. Interesting, they both use, like 40 years apart, they both use that word tumultuous. So the backstory here is, in the African tradition, music accompanies everything. Work, worship, play, domestic life, socializing, everything is accompanied by music and dancing. So we know that the slaves in this period would have 3 days, usually on Sundays. So according to this, they're gathering together, and inevitably they're probably singing and dancing and drumming. And to these Quakers, who are against any kind of music, this must have been tumultuous and riotous, right? So that's what they're writing here. So even though it doesn't say they're singing and dancing, that seems to be what they're implying, which would confirm the fact that this was happening as early as the 1600s, and John Fanning Watson was reporting about it probably in the later colonial period. Some other evidence of early music making by African Americans in Philadelphia. This letter from Isaac Norris, who was a very prominent Philadelphian, writes in 1719, "Thou knowest Negro Peter's ingenuity in making for himself and playing on a fiddle without any assistance." And Fanny Salter's Reminiscences of Colonial Days in Philadelphia, which was published by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, writes, "At the time of my grandfather's removal into the country," they're moving to the family's country estate along the Delaware River in what's now Tacony in lower northeast Philadelphia. She writes, "There were a goodly number of domestics in the kitchen, hired English and bought Africans. Of Daddy Caesar I have a vivid recollection. In his dialect there was as much African as English, and when a child I liked to hear his talk. And no Italian music is now so sweet to my ears as were then his African songs." So these accounts all confirm for us that the African Americans were preserving their African musical traditions here in Philadelphia. And in the colonial period, the conditions were not right for them to really develop their own musical styles and genres. But after the Revolution and into the 19th century, they began to develop their own unique music. And then in the 20th century, these musical styles that I mentioned, jazz and gospel and soul music, all come out of that. So of all these early groups, none were more restricted and oppressed than the African Americans, and none had a greater impact on the history of Philadelphia music than them. So, now, there were a number of other religious groups in Philadelphia, as I mentioned. They all brought their own musical traditions and practiced music in some form or fashion. This quote from Andreas Liebman, again, the pastor here, because there is freedom of conscience here, they have gathered together of every opinion and belief. Here's just a couple of examples. This is from the minute book of the Pennypack Baptist Church, was also known as Lower Dublin Baptist Church in 1688-89. They write, Elias Keach, our pastor or ourselves, commonly used to sing a psalm or part of a psalm upon the Lord's days publicly with the assembly before sermon. And Christ Church, the Anglican Church, was founded in 1695. The current building was begun in the 1720s. Psalm singing is a very important part of their services, and an organ was installed there in 1728. This is from their vestry minutes in 1728, sort of outlining the conditions that gave rise to the installation of an organ in that church. And then there's organs in a number of different churches in Philadelphia in the first half of the 18th century. These are all documented cases. There was not an organ here at Old Swedes, even though Justice Faulkner requested one back in 1701, and the mystics of the Wissahickon may have brought their portable organ here to be played during services, but an organ was not actually installed in this church until 1739. In 1729, Benjamin Franklin publishes in his print shop the Psalms of David, and in 1733 he publishes a new version of the Psalms of David fitted to the tunes used in the churches. So these are publications of psalms that were sung in the churches of Philadelphia in the early years. Now we move to the world of secular music and dancing, non-religious music. Religious music stayed, strong and grew as all these different settlers came here and congregations grew and expanded. But we're going to move into this other realm. And this secular music and dancing, no doubt, was occurring in the very earliest years, but there's very little documentation of it. And what documentation we do have is mostly from the newspapers. So you're going to see a lot of quotes from newspaper articles. In March of 1730, Thomas Ball advertises that singing, playing on the spinet, dancing, and all sorts of needlework are taught by his sister, lately arrived from London. And Ball's unnamed sister is the first music teacher on record in Philadelphia history. Around the same time, there's a notice in the newspaper that states, we hear that Tuesday night last, a young Dutchman was married to an old Dutch woman who was known to have money. They had a fiddle at the wedding. Now, you would think this would be a happy occasion, but the article goes on to say, when the bride was about to dance, the bridegroom told her he was obliged to go out a little way and would return in a short time. She danced till it was late, and then he not appearing, she went to look for him in the bedchamber. She found to her great surprise that he had been and taken away her money, and he has not since been heard of. So this was a very sad tale of this older Dutch woman getting bamboozled by this young sort of ne'er-do-well. In March of 1732, there's a notice that the Ancient Society of Britons celebrated St. David's Day with a variety of activities that concluded with music, mirth, and friendship. And the Ancient Society of Britons is a Welsh organization, and St. David's Day to them is kind of like St. Patrick's Day is to the Irish. There's a lot of festivities going on. Dancing was a very popular pastime in colonial Philadelphia. Again, not with the Quakers or some of the more conservative groups, but these other groups that were coming loved to dance. And so we begin to see a lot of ads for dancing masters and dancing lessons. In August of 1729, in the American Weekly Mercury, The Art of Dancing Carefully Taught by Samuel Perpoint, I guess, at his school in Chestnut Street, where for the recreation of all gentlemen and ladies, there will be country dances every Thursday evening. In 1738, here's an ad in the same paper. Theobald Hackett, lately come from London and Ireland, has opened a dancing school in this city where he will teach all sorts of fashionable English and French dances after the newest and politest manner practiced in London, Dublin, and Paris. Now, Philadelphia in this period is beginning to become a wealthy city. There's very wealthy merchants, and by that I don't mean shopkeepers, but men who are dealing in international trade and shipping. And there's professionals like lawyers and doctors. So a wealthy class is beginning to emerge, and they want to emulate the fine traditions of Europe. So you will see a lot of things of this nature appearing after the most fashionable tastes of the great cities of Europe. In 1749, there's an article that John Beals, music master from London, at his house in 4th Street, teaches the violin, hautboy, which is the oboe, German flute, common flute, which is the recorder, and dulcimer by note. He likewise provides music for balls or other entertainments. Now, what he's probably referring to in that last sentence is the Philadelphia Dancing Assembly. This is an organization that's founded in late 1748. It's a very elite membership-based organization. It's kind of modeled on English dancing assemblies. Membership is restricted to the highest levels of society. You couldn't be a laborer or a shopkeeper and get into this group. This is the elite of the elite in Philadelphia. And they have these formal dances every couple of weeks during the season. And it's a very popular pastime for these wealthy Philadelphians who are now wanting to enjoy the finer things in life and to emulate the practices of Europe. Here's a ticket, 1772. The favor of Miss Becky Redmond. Company is requested for the season, so you would have a ticket that would get you in. And the Minuet was a dance that was a stately dance that usually opened the assembly hall. And so we're now going to hear an 18th century minuet, something you would have heard at the dancing assembly in Philadelphia in the 1750s. Now, interestingly, the dancing assembly still exists. It's the oldest continuously operating dancing organization in America. Founded in 1748, it's now 270 years old. Now they have an annual assembly ball, like once a year, instead of having dances every couple of weeks. Of course, that's the elite that are dancing, right? There's also folk music and folk dancing. There's all these different ethnic groups are here, the Irish and the Scottish and the Germans. They all have their folk music, their folk dances, their folk songs. We're going to hear now a folk song from the Scottish tradition, the ballad Barbara Allen, which was a very popular ballad in the colonial period.
In Scarlet Town, where I was born, there was a fair maid dwelling, made all the youths cry well a day. Her name was Barbara Allen. 'Twas in the merry month of May, and the green buds they were swelling. Young William Green on his deathbed lay, for the love of Barbara Allen.
And then there are also in this period private concerts, what we would call salons, like invitation only. So here's a entry in the diary of a visitor to Philadelphia in 1744. He writes, "At 8 o'clock, went to hear a concert of music. The performances was some town's gentleman and did us the honor of an invitation." So this is an invitation only. It's not like a public concert. And then this Gottlieb Mittelberger, who was a German musician who was in Philadelphia in 1750, writes, "The cultivation of music is rather rare as yet. Some Englishmen give occasional concerts in private houses with a spinet or harpsichord." Now we know actually that Mittelberger was here in the summer, and that's when all the wealthy people got out of the city and went to their country estates. So there wasn't as much music happening when he happened to be here. But he's right that there wasn't a lot of public music. Most of the music was these private. So you'd go, to the dancing assembly if you were, in the elite class, or maybe there were musical performance in a church, or there would be a private salon. But we didn't yet have public concerts, which are going to be coming shortly. So we're now at the mid-18th century, and Philadelphia is the largest, wealthiest city in the American colonies. It has a very diverse population, lots of different ethnic groups and religious groups. The Quaker influence has diminished considerably. There's upper class, elite, and there's people of all classes and stations in life practicing music, and a public musical life begins to emerge, a public musical life. And the first concert on record in Philadelphia happened on January 25th, 1757. This is the first time where anybody can go buy a ticket and go to this event. It's not like invitation membership only. So in the newspaper on January 20th, there's this notice: "By particular desire, on Tuesday next, the 25th instant, at the Assembly Room in Lodge Alley, will be performed a concert of music under the direction of Mr. John Palmer, to begin at exactly 6 o'clock. Tickets to be had at the London Coffee House, $1 each. No one admitted without a ticket." Now, the Assembly Room in Lodge Alley is this building in Lodge. It was called Lodge Hall. It was actually Freemasons' Lodge. This was built in 1755. It's the first Masonic Lodge building in America. But on the second floor of this building was the Assembly Room. This is where this concert was, and this is where most of the concerts and dances in Philadelphia were held in the late 18th century, on the second floor of this building. And where it was, in this photo on the right, it's where those cars were parked. So the building that you just see a little bit of on the right is the U.S. Customs House at 2nd and Chestnut Street. So that faces Chestnut Street, and this is 2nd Street. So this is the parking lot behind the Customs House. And if you look at this map on the left, you can see City Tavern there, just above 2nd and Walnut Street. Well, immediately north of City Tavern is an alley. And then there's another alley north of that. That alley was Lodge Alley. And that's where this assembly room was, or Lodge Hall was. And the Lodge Hall was where those cars were parked. I give tours on early Philadelphia music, and I want to say, with great excitement, and here's the site of the first concert in Philadelphia, and it's just this ugly parking lot, but that's where it was. We do not have the program for this concert, or most of the earliest concerts. We do know from other programs and other reports that most of the pieces were by Italian or British composers, most of whom have long since been forgotten. They're not like great names, like Mozart or Haydn or anything like that. One composer whose pieces are frequently on these programs was the Earl of Kelly, who's a Scottish nobleman and composer. His real name is Thomas Alexander Erskine. And his overtures you will see often on these programs. So here's a recording of one of his overtures. You would have heard something like this in some of the concerts in Colonial, Philadelphia. mind that this recording is a polished string orchestra with woodwinds, and the musical forces in Philadelphia at this time would have been much smaller, probably much less, talented or advanced. So it would have been much more rough-hewn performance than what that sounds like. Around the same time as the very first public concert happened in Philadelphia, the very first performance of a serious opera in America happened here, just a few blocks away at the College of Philadelphia, which later becomes the University of Pennsylvania. Their original location was 4th and Arch Streets. It would be the southwest corner of 4th and Arch Street. There's a hotel there now. And in the building on the left in that illustration, College Hall, is where this happened. So the story behind this is the first class of the College of Philadelphia is a small group of young men, no women or students. And a part of their studies, they're studying oratory. So as part of that, they give an oratorical performance. And the provost of the college, William Smith, selects this English opera, The Mask of Alfred, composed by Thomas Arne, an English composer. And according to the newspaper account, the young gentlemen of the college, for their improvement in oratory, presented this version of this opera. John Palmer, who conducted that first concert in the same week, is the conductor, and the female vocal parts of the opera are performed by two young ladies of the city. Now, this is a serious dramatic work that incorporates music, dancing, scenery, drama. So most historians consider this the first serious opera performance in America. There's a thing which we're going to talk about in a minute called ballad opera, which was a very popular form of entertainment, but the word opera is kind of misleading in that because ballad opera is kind of like musical comedy, kind of lighthearted fare. That was very popular. But this is like serious opera, like grand opera. And so the first such performance in America happened in January of 1757 into February. It went on for several days. That building on the left, College Hall and 4th and Arch Street, is where it happened. In the middle there is the provost of the College of Philadelphia, William Smith, who's kind of the producer. And then on the right is somebody we're going to talk about in a minute, Francis Hopkinson, who was a student performer and a very prominent Philadelphian in this time. A couple of months later, in January, we have the first concert and the first opera. In March, there's an advertisement for another concert in Lodge Hall, in the assembly room in Lodge Hall. And the man who's directing the concert is not mentioned in the newspaper ad, but there's a young Virginia military officer who's in Philadelphia at that time, and he makes a note in his journal, his ledger book, that he purchased tickets from Mr. Palmer. And that young military officer was George Washington, who was then 25 years old. He's in Philadelphia on business. When George Washington lived in Philadelphia in the 1790s as president of the new United States, he was a frequent patron of the arts, going to concerts and theater performances. We're pretty sure this is the first time he attended a concert in Philadelphia, probably the first time he attended a concert anywhere. But that was the second public concert in Philadelphia history. Now, musical theater was another very popular form of entertainment. Again, not with the Quakers or the conservative factions of the city, but with people that enjoyed such things. When you went to the theater in the 18th century, it was like an all-night affair. There was the main piece, the main work, which like a Shakespearean drama or some comedy or something, but they inserted a lot of music into it. There would be songs and dances stuck in the middle. There would be musical preludes, interludes, postludes. So when you went to the theater, you heard a lot of music. And then after the main piece, there would be an after piece, which is that ballad opera I mentioned earlier. This is a shorter, lighthearted kind of romp, a musical comedy. It featured bawdy songs with double entendres, lots of dancing and witty dialogue. So there were these sort of short musical comedies after the main piece, but the main piece had a lot of music too. So when you went to the theater in Colonial Philadelphia, you heard a lot of music. Now, the first theater performances on record in Philadelphia were in late 1749. This troupe from England, they weren't that good, and they encountered a lot of opposition. So they didn't stay long, and they left for New York. And then, like 5 years later, the Hallam Company comes in the spring of 1754, and they're a celebrated troupe from London. They're well known. They take up residence in Philadelphia. Remember, Philadelphia is now the cultural capital of the American colony. So all the Europeans that are coming to Philadelphia. Like today, you would go to New York or Los Angeles, well, then you would go to Philadelphia. So they also faced a lot of opposition, but they were eventually allowed to stage a season of plays. All these stipulations, they couldn't present anything indecent or immoral. They had to give benefit performances. But here are some playbills, the handbills you would get from April and June of 1754 of the Hallam Company's performances in Philadelphia. They start with the phrase, by a company of comedians, which is just a general term for actors, in the colonial period. Company of comedians from London at the new theater in Water Street, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you can see more clearly at the playbill on the left, Fair Penitent is the main feature. And then about halfway down it says, to which will be added a farce called Miss in Her Teens. So that's the ballad opera, the afterpiece. So this is the typical sort of format of a theater program in this period. You would hear lots of music there. And the new theater in Water Street was William Plumstead's warehouse. William Plumstead was a wealthy Quaker merchant. He later becomes the mayor of Philadelphia. But Water Street ran right along the river, and between Pine and Lombard Streets on Water Street were his warehouses, which were converted into a theater. The Hallam Company later built some temporary theater structures on South Street, a little further inland. And then in 1766, they built the Southwark Theater. And this is the first permanent theater building in America. Prior to this, theater was generally in a barn or a warehouse that was used for that purpose. But so this was on South Street, just a little west of 4th Street. And it was, South Street was then the southern boundary of the city of Philadelphia. The incorporated city stopped at South Street. This was built on the south side of South Street, deliberately outside the city limits, so that they would not be subjected to sometimes onerous restrictions that you would have in the city. So that's why it was deliberately built there. And the Southwark Theater serves as the sort of center of theatrical life in Philadelphia until the Chestnut Street Theater opens in the 1790s. The most popular ballad opera in this period was The Beggar's Opera, which was composed in London in 1728, very popular in Europe and in America. And so The Beggar's Opera is one of the ballad operas you would have heard at the Southwark Theater in this period. And we're going to hear a song from The Beggar's Opera called Fill Every Glass.
Fill every glass, for wine inspires us and fires us with courage, love, and joy. Women and wine shed life and joy. Is there aught else on earth desirous? Fill every glass, for wine inspires us and fires us with courage, love, and joy.
So the musicians that are performing in these theaters, in these concerts, in these salons, there's a number of immigrant professional musicians from Europe. Again, Philadelphia is the cultural capital, so they're gravitating to the city. So there's a number of them. We've seen John Palmer, who directed the first concerts, and the Mask of Alfred Opera. We saw John Beals earlier, the music master from London. We're going to talk at length a little bit about Giovanni Gualdo. But there's also a lot of gentlemen amateurs. These are wealthy Philadelphia men who are not professional musicians, but they love music as an avocation. And they gather together in salons and concerts and musical activities. John Penn, who's the grandson of William Penn, the Penn family had long since left Quakerism and become Anglicans. He's the last colonial governor of Pennsylvania. Michael Hillegas, German, he eventually becomes treasurer, the first treasurer of the United States. He has a music store, the first music store in Philadelphia in the 1750s. Thomas Jefferson is here frequently for the Continental Congress and other events, the political events. He's a lover of music. Benjamin Franklin, Philadelphia is his adopted hometown. He loves music. He composes a little bit. He invents this instrument, the glass harmonica, the musical glasses, which is, the glasses rotate and these sounds come out of it. But the most important of all of these guys, and the kind of the center of all this activity, is Francis Hopkinson. He's kind of one of my musical heroes. Just a remarkable man. I mean, beyond music, he was one of the founding fathers, the signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's a member of the Constitutional Convention, the first Secretary of the Navy. He's a lawyer, a judge, but he's considered America's first poet-composer. And he played a key role in the musical life of Philadelphia in the late 18th century, as we will see. As part of his musical activities, he was part of that class of the College of Philadelphia that performed the Mask of Alfred opera. He later organizes and participates in lots of concerts. He's a composer, he's a harpsichordist and organist, both in sacred music and in secular music. He's the organist at Christ Church for a little while. He corresponds with Thomas Jefferson about improvements to the harpsichord. And actually, if you go to Christ Church, there's a plaque that hit the pew. They used to rent their pews. So there's a pew there with Francis Hopkinson, and I always go there and sit in that whenever I go there. One of the first times we encounter him named musically is the commencement services at the College of Philadelphia in 1760. Now, he had gotten a bachelor's degree, then he goes on to get his master's degree, and the newspaper report of the commencement service in May of 1760 writes, one of the students who we know, they're referring to Hopkinson, who received his master's degree on this occasion, conducted the organ with that bold and masterly hand for which he is celebrated, and several of the pieces were also his own compositions. So, even in his 20s, he's making a name for himself. I love this description of him by John Adams, writing to his wife, Abigail. He is one of your pretty little curious ingenious men. His head is not bigger than a large apple. I have not met with anything in natural history more amusing and entertaining than his personal appearance. Yet he is genteel and well-bred and is very social. I'm not sure how much of a compliment that is, but I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. In 1788, Francis Hopkinson publishes 7 songs for the harpsichord or forte piano. He dedicates it to his good friend, George Washington. And on the dedication page, this is 1788, he writes, I cannot, I believe, be refused the credit of being the first native of the United States who has produced a musical composition. Now, the story here is the Constitution had just been ratified, and we just became the United States of America for the first time. Francis Hopkinson was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. So some historians say that he's saying that now that we're the United States, I am the first native-born one to write a composition, for native-born of the United States. However, he could also be referring to this song, My Days Have Been So Wondrous Free, which he wrote many years earlier in 1759. This is the manuscript copy, which is in the Library of Congress in his hand. This is considered the first popular song in American history, written in 1759 by Francis Hopkinson. We're going to hear it now. Now, concerts are still happening. In 1764, we have the first concert season subscription, where you take out a subscription for the whole season. So the season is from January to May of 1764. The concerts are in the Assembly Room at Lodge Hall. The second set of subscription concerts is November of 64 through March of 65, also at the Assembly Room in Lodge Hall. Another common occurrence was benefit concerts. Musicians would have a concert for their own benefit. You see this a lot in the colonial period. This one for Mr. Forage, but it's interesting, the last half of the ad for it says, a concert of music consisting of a variety of the most celebrated pieces now in taste, in which also will be introduced the famous harmonica, or musical glasses, so much admired for the sweetness and delicacy of its tone. This is the instrument that Benjamin Franklin invented. Unfortunately, he had just left for England. He was going to be in England for quite a while, and he didn't get to hear his instrument performed in this concert. And now we come to John Waldo, this kind of interesting and ultimately tragic character. And we're going to sort of follow him for a number of years through the newspaper ads. So he first shows up in August of 1767, putting a notice that he's got a bunch of instruments for sale, and he's also a wine merchant. He's got his place in Walnut Street between the Front and Second Streets. Next, he shows up in December of 1768. He's advertising that he's offering lessons. People can come to his place, or he will go to their place if it's not too far away, he says. Then we see him in February of 1769. He's selling instruments. He's got a German gentleman who teaches various instruments. He has a servant boy who copies out music if you need music copied out. And then he says at the end, this is February of 69, he says, next October at the farthest, Mr. Waldo intends to set off for Europe, where he is going to transact some particular and advantageous business for himself and other gentlemen of his town. Well, come next November, he hasn't left. He's still here, and he gives a notice that he's going to present a concert at the Assembly Room, and there will be a ball afterwards, a dance. We have the program for this concert. We often don't have the program, but this one was published in the paper. And you can see opening and closing the concert is an overture by the Earl of Kelly, who we mentioned earlier. The second piece on the program is by Miss Hallam, a song. She's part of the Hallam troupe that was performing at the Southwark Theater. But a number of the pieces, the last two in the first act, the first one in the second act, and then later, are by Waldo himself. And this is sometimes considered the first composer concert in American history, where a composer puts on a concert that features a lot of his music. So that is November of 1769. A little bit later, he puts another notice in the paper. He's saying he's going to present a subscription series of concerts at Mr. Davenport's, which is a new hotel on 3rd Street. It actually fails, doesn't last very long. But Waldo says, Mr. Waldo's principal views in this undertaking are to oblige his acquaintances and to compensate in some measures those losses which he has sustained in this town, partly through his own imprudences, and above all through false friends and malevolence. So I don't know what's going on, but he's misbehaving and his friends are not being loyal to him. So that is November of 1769. A year later, he shows up again. He's going to give another concert at the Assembly Room. For this one, at the end there, he says he's composed 6 new minuets with proper cadence for dancing, and he flatters himself that they will be favorably received. Then in the following year, he says, this is in August, he writes that the 18th of October, he intends to give a concert again at the Assembly Room. But in October of that year, Francis Hopkinson writes to John Penn, Senior Waldo lies in chains in one of the cells of Pennsylvania Hospital. which is the institution for the mentally ill. And he dies in December 1771. So ends the twisting tale of John or Giovanni Gualdo. He's one of the many immigrant musicians who are hustling around Philadelphia doing concerts and lessons and selling instruments. His fate, apparently he had some mental issues and his fate was a tragic one. But lots of other concerts are happening. Here's one in November of 1771. It says in the middle there, favorite overtures performed by a full band of music with trumpets, kettle drums, and every instrument that can be introduced with propriety. In 1774, Mr. Victor, musician to Her late Royal Highness the Princess of Wales and an organist at St. George's in London, he's arrived here and he's going to start giving lessons. But he notes at the end, Mr. Victor intended to give a concert but is obliged to postpone it for want of able hands. What's happening here is we're getting ready for war, right? This is late 1774, and right around that time, the First Continental Congress is meeting at Carpenter's Hall, and tensions are building with the mother country, and the delegates to the Continental Congress, they pass a lot of directives and resolutions and boycotts and whatnot. But they also write, we will discountenance and discourage every species of extravagance and dissipation, exhibitions of shows, plays, and other expensive diversions and entertainments. Basically, they're saying, we can't be doing all this frivolous stuff. We got to get on a war footing. So there's sort of a formal effort to suppress any public concerts, any theater. And so the whole musical culture begins to sort of wither away in the advance of war. That's in September of 1774. The following spring, war actually breaks out. That summer, July of 1776, the Declaration of Independence is written just about a mile from here. So now we're an independent nation, but we're at war. And one of the rallying cries of the war is the song Yankee Doodle, which kind of has an interesting history. The melody goes back to the 1500s, but the words were written in the 1750s by British soldiers who were stationed here, who were lampooning and demeaning the crude, unsophisticated Americans, like stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. This is a very derogatory, kind of derisive lyric. And so this song that the British wrote the words, to lampoon the Americans, in the Revolutionary War becomes the rallying patriotic song of the colonial forces. And there's many versions of it. So this is a fife and drum version that you would have heard the colonial forces playing, the fifes and the drums. People also sung it. So that's one of the songs that sort of was very popular during the Revolution. Then in September of 1777, the British occupy Philadelphia. On the morning of September 26th, Philadelphians awake to hear the British forces with their fifes and drums playing God Save the King, the English anthem. So we're going to hear that. Now, the British are here for like 9 months, and their occupation really marks the end of an era in Philadelphia music history, because all of this musical activity that had been developing and flourishing sort of comes to a stop. The British put on a lot of music while they're here, And after they leave, there's like military music by the Colonial forces. But in terms of concerts and public events and theater music, that all stops, and it doesn't really revive until the later part of the 1780s, long after the Revolutionary War is over. So the British occupation of Philadelphia in the fall of 1777 kind of is a real turning point and end of an era in Philadelphia music history. Normally I would end there, but I don't want the British to have the last word. So we're going to move into 1788 just a little bit for the Battle of the Kegs, written by our friend Francis Hopkinson. And the story behind this is the British Navy is in the Philadelphia harbor, right? And the colonial forces are upstream. They send powder kegs down. These are wooden casks filled with explosives to like ram the British ships and explode and damage the ships. The British get wind of this and they send sharpshooters to the riverside to shoot these kegs so they would explode before they could reach the ships. So the Americans like cast this as a very pathetic exercise, the Battle of the Kegs. How demeaning and demoralizing is it? How embarrassing for the British to be like shooting at these unarmed kegs. There's the Battle of the Kegs, this very sort of satirical song. So Francis Hopkinson writes this song to the tune of Yankee Doodle, describing the Battle of the Kegs, this, sort of really lampooning the British. So that's the last song we're going to hear.
'Twas early day, as poets say, just when the sun was rising. A soldier stood on a log of wood and saw a sight surprising. A sailor too, in jerkin blue, the strange appearance viewing, first damned his eyes in great surprise, then said, some mischief's brewing. These kegs now hold the rebels bold, packed up like pickled herring, and they're come down to attack the town in this new way of ferrying. Therefore prepare for bloody war, these kegs must all be routed, or surely we despised shall be, and British courage doubted.
And that takes us to the end of our study of colonial music in Philadelphia. We've gone from the 1670s, the first sort of documented music in Philadelphia, through the 1770s with the Revolutionary War. So it's a sort of a trajectory of music from this barren musical landscape to this flourishing one, and then an abrupt stop. After the Revolution, Philadelphia becomes Athens of America. It's again the cultural capital of the colonies. That was a very rich musical tradition, but that's another era.
I'm Jeanette Ware, Gloria Day Church historian and archivist. This 1903 Hook Hastings organ contains 2 manuals and 1,300 pipes, and originally 22 ranks. It has mechanical action with pneumatic assist for the bottom 2 octaves on the manuals. In 1993, the organ was rebuilt and enlarged by R.J. Bruner and Company, located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. 5 ranks were added at that time, increasing the total to 27 ranks. The congregation took a road trip to visit our organ. It was interesting to visit the various parts of the organ. In one building, the pipes were located, in another, the keyboard and the pedals, and in the last, the housing where years of paint were removed. Our organ is a large, small organ. Some of the pipes are larger than on a large organ, giving it a warm and large sound. We are very fortunate to have an excellent organist, Paul Faco, who makes the instruments sing and fill our church with wonderful sounds.
Hello, we're outside of Gloria Day Church. I hope you enjoyed the lecture from Jack McCarthy. I would just want to give you a quick update on our Keystone project. You can see that we're getting down to the original wood here, and we're filling in where we've had wear and tear on the building. So this will all be smoothed out and painted and looking fresh and new. And then over here at Riverside Hall, which is our church hall for events, you see at the upper level, we're currently repairing that, painting and repairing and painting. And then along the roof line, you'll see the cornice has had extensive repair already. missing pieces have been fabricated and filled in. It has its primer coat on, and it will be getting its final coat soon. So we're continuing to work outdoors while the weather is still warm enough to do that, and then we'll be moving into the church sanctuary to work in there. So maybe at our next Great Talks at Gloria Day, I'll be showing you what we're doing inside the church. But right now, a lot of exciting things are happening outdoors. So I hope you will consider hitting that donate button and help our efforts of preserving Gloria Day Old Sweets Church. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Amy Grant. I am the Corporate Secretary of the Historic Gloria Day Preservation Corporation. And you've already seen Jack on camera, and now he is here to answer your questions. So if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A chat window. I haven't gotten any questions in yet, but maybe I can ask a couple while we're waiting. So what types? So you mentioned at some point in the talk that some of the early concerts in Philadelphia would have had sort of very limited instruments and instrumentation. What kinds of instruments would we have seen at that time?
And most of them in the earliest part were imported. I mean, there were some instrument makers in Philadelphia, particularly organ makers early on, but there weren't that many. So in the early period, they would have been imported violins, flutes, and there's the two kinds of flutes. There's the German flute, which you held up, to the side, and then the recorder, which is the one that was more vertical. Harpsichords and spinets, which were like small keyboard instruments, oboes. I guess that's about it. Things like the clarinet was much later. There's not much reference to things like bassoons or trumpets occasionally. So the musical forces in Philadelphia in the early years, there weren't that many, either instruments or people to play them. But of course, as time went on, more and more, instruments were imported or began to be made. But it wasn't enough to like field a full orchestra. There were, probably what you would call chamber groups playing this music. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question from the audience. Did the Quakers try to outlaw music and dance as immoral?
Yes and no. I mean, there was a lot of, first of all, they did not try to suppress any religious music, that these other denominations were practicing. There were some efforts to, for lack of time, I didn't go into it too much in this talk, but there were some other dance groups, like not quite so exclusive as the dancing assemblies, but there were some other groups that used to get together to dance. And then there were these conservative elements that tried to like board up their building and not let them get access to it. And some of the religious groups, like the Presbyterians, were very conservative, and they only believed in music for worship, and they didn't believe in any secular music. So there were some efforts occasionally to suppress dancing, but it's not like it was a widespread thing. It wasn't like some government-sponsored effort to suppress. It was more like some conservative elements in the city would write things in the newspaper decrying, these immoral activities. So there were some sporadic efforts to stop it, but nothing too coordinated. The one thing that was very coordinated to stop was theater. When theater first came, there were a lot of elements in the city, again, like the Quakers and the Presbyterians and some others, who really thought the theater was just like an immoral life altogether. There was no redeeming value to the theater. So there was plenty of efforts to suppress that. And that's what drove that first theater group, who came in 1749. They didn't stay long because there was just too much opposition. And then in 1754, when the Halloms came, there was still a lot of opposition, but a lot more support was in the community. They had a lot more support, and so they were eventually allowed to stay. So there was throughout the 18th century this sort of tug of war between the forces of asceticism, without no entertainment or anything, and then the people who enjoyed some of the finer things in life. That kind of was going on throughout the 18th century.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. Can you talk some more about the earliest known instrument makers locally, please?
Yeah, well, the one thing I actually also omitted from the talk for lack of time was this man named John Barent, who built the first piano in America. In 1775, there's an ad in the paper. The piano was originally called the piano forte. That was, or piano forte. That was the full name of the instrument. And so he advertised a new instrument by the name of the piano forte, I built in my shop. And this was 1775, and that's the first documented piano built in America. There were also a number of organ builders going back to the early years of the 18th century. I'm not as well versed in them, but they were building organs. A lot of them were German, and they were building organs for these churches. There was an organ in Christ Church. There was an organ in the Catholic Church. There was an organ in some other churches. So there were several organ builders, and some of them were became sort of part of the Pennsylvania German tradition. They were building organs also for some of the congregations out in the rural areas of Pennsylvania. I have not come across many instrument makers in the 18th century other than that, though, like people making violins or things like that. There may have been, but there's not a lot of record of it. I think most of the instruments were imported in the colonial period.
Okay, here's another question. Can you talk about music or dancing of non-gentry folk?
Well, it's not as well documented. I'm sure it happened, and like I mentioned I showed that article in the newspaper about that older Dutch woman who they were dancing at the wedding, and then her young groom ran off with her money. They were talking about dancing at the wedding. So there's occasional references to this kind of, either folk dancing or popular dancing and singing, but it's just not as well documented. Well, I'm sure it was happening, but it was more what the written record documents are religious music and the music of the wealthy class and these salon concerts and then later public concerts. So there's just not a lot of written record of the different folk dancing and popular songs. And we know there were I mentioned the ballads, the Scottish ballad, and of course there were German folk music, and there was all the different ethnic groups had their music. But again, it's just not as well documented, so I can't really explore it. I have found a few references, but I'm sure there was much more happening than the surviving record shows.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. Regarding the influence of African slave music, when did slave music begin to be incorporated into the ballad opera?
I don't think it ever was. I didn't imply that. Yeah, there's no evidence that the ballad opera was absorbing any African American influences. That didn't really happen until the 19th century with the minstrel show, which began to sort of become, I guess in the 1820s and 30s, there were in the theater, there were these characters that would imitate African American dancing and singing. And then that evolved into the minstrel show, which was a formal kind of show that purportedly was based on African American music. But that was much later. That's in the 19th century. In the 18th century that I'm talking about, there's no evidence that African American musical influences infiltrated the theater. And most of the theater that we had in Philadelphia was from England. It was imported from England, so it probably wouldn't have had as much of that influence anyway.
So from the same person, did Blacks start singing the popular "My Days Have Been So Wondrous Free"?
No, that would have been just the music of the upper class. That song, that Francis Hopkinson wrote that song. He was traveling, in the highest levels of society, and that really wouldn't have been a song you would have even heard on the street, or even among the white residents, let alone the African Americans. So that was like a whole different world, that Francis Hopkinson was moving in.
So there's another question. Is there a known history of African American musicians in Philadelphia prior to Francis Johnson?
No, not that I know of. I mean, there's well, you could say Richard Allen was writing hymns he was the pastor of Mother Bethel, African Methodist Episcopal Church, and around, I think it was 1800 or 1801, he published a hymnal for his congregation. Again, this is beyond the colonial period I talked about in this talk, but he was writing hymns for his congregation, and there were these African American religious congregations that were forming around that time, and so there is some evidence of that music. But prior to Frank or Francis Johnson, we know there were African Americans playing music, but there is no sort of there's very little documentation of it. Francis Johnson is the first one to have the first African American in America to have his music published, and that was published, I think, in 1818, his first publication. So that's the very first published music by an African American in America. So prior to that, I'm sure there were African Americans who were performing, but there isn't much surviving evidence of it.
Okay. It was fascinating to hear about Africans gathering across geographic backgrounds for music and dance. Is this documented anywhere where one can read that you know of?
No, that's a problem. I read that quote from the history by John Fanning Watson, where he was collecting the reminiscences of these people that lived in the colonial period, and that's the only reference to the African music being played in what's now Washington Square. We know that they were gathering there because of that statement, but there's very little other evidence. Whatever evidence there is, I presented in this talk. There were those things from the provincial council and the city council about the tumultuous gatherings of the Negroes, which I am interpreting to mean they were singing and dancing. There was that quote from Isaac Norris about the slave that he had playing the fiddle, and then there was that quote from Fanny Salter about the African American enslaved guy on their estate that was singing African songs to her. But there's very little documentation other than that of these activities, and it's a shame because we know that they were happening, but these communities just weren't well documented. It was more the wealthier class that would have their records preserved.
I may have missed this, but what kinds of instruments, if any, did the Blacks have in Congo Square or Washington Square?
Yeah, Washington Square. So what this questioner is referring to, there's the very famous Congo Square in New Orleans. And this is where the slaves were allowed to gather on Sundays and sing and drum and dance, and people would come from all over to watch and listen to this. It became very famous. And Washington Square is Philadelphia's version of Congo Square. It's sometimes called Philadelphia's Congo Square. So this, and again, the only evidence that we have of this is that quote from John Fanning Watson, which he gathered information from the interviews that he did with people that were alive in the colonial period. So they don't talk about any instruments. They don't talk about, any specific songs or anything. So there really is no evidence. That one quote I mentioned from Isaac Norris about his, was it Negro Peter? Was that I can't remember the name now, but making and playing on a fiddle. So we know from that quote that this enslaved guy made a fiddle and played it. But otherwise, there's very little evidence of this music making instruments or what instruments they played.
Do we know of any songs of the time that are about or mention any Philadelphia locations or events?
Whew, not that I have come across. I mean that one song at the very end, the Battle of the Kegs, refers to the British soldiers firing on these wooden caskets in the Delaware River. But otherwise, I don't think there's any songs that refer to a specific place. I haven't thought about that, but I don't recall ever coming across something like that. A lot of the music that was being played, especially in the upper classes, was European derived. It was imported from Europe, so it wouldn't have been local. But then there were people like Francis Hopkinson who were writing songs. And there were some songs, not from Philadelphia, but from New England that were, talking about places in New England or places in the Revolutionary War. But other than that, but they weren't Philadelphia songs. So I don't know of any songs that really reference a particular location in Philadelphia. A lot of the upper class, the songs were kind of very superficial love songs and that kind of, they weren't really talking about real life, I guess is the right way to put it.
We were emailing earlier today. I'm very interested in the dancing assemblies.
The dancing assembly was a membership organization. It was one organization, and they would have their dances in different places. But there were also some smaller groups that would get together. If you remember one of the newspaper ads I mentioned, with the one dancing instructor said, every Thursday we're going to have a country dance, that kind of thing. So there were like these smaller dancing groups that would get together. But the dancing assembly was the creme de la creme of Philadelphia society, and it was a membership organization. You had to pay to be a member, and you weren't admitted unless you were a member or a guest of a member. So that was the one main organization, but there were other little dances that would happen. Giovanni Gualdo mentioned, after the concert at the Assembly Room, there will be a dance or there will be a ball. So there were dances happening in different, settings other than the dancing assembly as an organization.
There's another question. Do we know if children of the wealthy received music lessons, either vocal or instrumental?
Yes, they did. Like, again, this would be the wealthy class, but they would be expected, like George Washington, when he was in Philadelphia. Again, this is a little after the colonial period. It was, the early federal period. But when he was in Philadelphia, there were some Philadelphia musicians that were giving his granddaughters lessons. And so the wealthy class of the city the non-Quakers. Of course, there's the wealthy Quaker class, and then there was the wealthy sort of other class. Usually they were Anglicans, the Church of England members, but they were definitely giving their sons, well, mostly, and a lot of their daughters were expected to play the harpsichord and sing. So yes, that was common.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Where can one see more about the 19th century or take a tour?
I have given walking tours for Hidden City, Philadelphia. I do 2 walking tours. One is on Philadelphia jazz, which is a whole other thing. But I also do one occasionally on early Philadelphia music, where we go to some of these places that I was talking about. But all those tours have kind of been suspended, since the COVID shutdown. But what I would do is check Hidden City, Philadelphia. When they revive their tours, I might be doing some of my walking tours again. Otherwise, the person was asking about 19th century music. There's no specific programs about that I know about, lectures. I mean, I don't lecture on that era so much. I do like real early Colonial, and then I do like 20th century. I don't do the 19th century too much. So I don't know. I don't know where you would go for lectures about that.
Did the dancing assemblies have an economic impact on commerce in Philadelphia?
I never really studied that aspect of it. I mean, these were the wealthiest of Philadelphians. They gathered, sometimes they would meet in City Tavern or a fancy hotel. They did employ musicians, and they did employ caterers. And I guess and to that extent, food and drink, so to that extent, they were sort of, helping to keep a sort of entertainment industry going. But again, these were private events, so it wasn't like the public was coming, paying to come see this. But they all had, they had their fancy carriages and their fancy clothes, so they had to keep people employed, to maintain that lifestyle. And then they would have musicians and food and drink. So to some extent, yeah. I don't think it was a big part of the city's economy, though.
Okay. Well, Jack, thank you so much for giving your talk and for being with us this evening for the Q&A. This was wonderful. I really enjoyed the whole lecture, which for me, this was the first time seeing it, by the way, so it was really exciting. And I loved the music samples as well. So thank you so much. So thank you all for joining us tonight. As you may or may not know, the Historic Gloria Day Preservation Corporation is an all-volunteer board. We do not have any paid staff members. So any events or programming or publications that we put together are completely volunteer-driven. And as you saw from what Candy presented earlier this evening, we are in the process of restoring and rehabilitating 3 of the 5 buildings on our campus, thanks to a Keystone grant that we received from the state. So if you are so inclined, please consider making a donation to support our programming, to support our preservation efforts, and to keep Gloria Day Old Sweets Church here for another 300 years or more. So if you want to make a donation, go to our website, which is preserveoldswedes.org. If you have any follow-up questions that you would like us to pass on to Jack, please email us at preserveoldswedes@gmail.com. Thanks so much. Have a great evening.
All right. Good night.